Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dentistry Unmasked. I'm David Rice. I'm here as usual with
Hey, Pam Maragliano-Muniz, what's going on?
so much going on. So excited for today because I don't know, it's probably not just a dentist thing, but it feels like it's definitely a dental thing for sure. We blame lots of stuff on lots of things, but there might be a simpler, far more valuable and more important something to focus on. So, Pam, got a pretty darn good guest today.
We have an amazing guest. We have Dr. Matt Allen, who is going to spill the tea on an important topic that really is integrated within every aspect of our lives and within every relationship we have, whether it's professional or personal. It's trust. So, Matt, welcome.
Thank you so much. So excited to be here. I love both of your energy. Certainly, listening to your podcast brings me energy for doing my own, and so I appreciate the opportunity to be here and have a conversation.
Well, first things first, shout out your podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a podcast too. It's called Kind of Different. Our company's called Different Kind, so kind of play on words there. But yeah, we talk about how to make dental care more human. That's really the whole idea in our podcast. And so, if you're interested in that, please come check us out. Come listen.
Wait, so there's people connected to the teeth.
I mean, it's hard to believe, right? It's crazy.
Huh.
You wouldn't think most people don't seem to realize that. So
Can you imagine if you're just like, all you are is teeth to me? Can you imagine like telling your patient that, or like that's the sentiment behind how you practice or which you live?
here's
So
the thing, like in dental school though, right? Like we all go to dental school or hygiene school or wherever it is and practice on these like dummies that only have teeth. They need to like create a better way of being like, hey, here's this, dummy guy person that ultimately can talk to you and tell you if they trust you or something like that, so that maybe like we would treat people as more than teeth. I don't know. I just had that idea like literally right now as I thought back to my dental school experience. Like, oh yeah, like literally you'd like put the teeth in the mouth, right? So,
You're leveling up the type it on experience. I like
hey,
that.
exactly,
well, we all
exactly.
have that classmate, right? That had the type it on. You had to zip the face over the type it on, and it's cut open from like the angle of the mouth, the commissure, like pretty much to the ear. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
don't want to go in that chair.
Yeah,
No,
exactly.
the Joker.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we started off sort of talking about trust, and really there's no way you can even function in this world without having the trust of the people closest to you, or as a business owner having a loyal clientele, or having a team that stays with you over the test of time. Or I don't know about you guys, but I belong to the Facebook group that posts all of the negative reviews, and there's always an excuse for it or like a finger point for it. But if your patient trusted you, or if your team trusted you, like maybe we wouldn't have all these problems in the world. And it's easy to say you need to establish rapport, you need to build trust. You hear these little statements that you're like, oh, yes, yes, I must do that. Oh, I think I do that well. But you, Matt, have the ability to measure trust. Would you tell us all about that?
Yes, let's start. There's there we can go down a really deep well here, right? But I think you're right. I think that's one of those things that trust in general has been one of those things where people tell you it's like be kind. You're like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Be compassionate. You're like, those are really good, ideals and values to aspire to. But there's actually some really kind of core behaviors that we can quantify and we can measure, that can really help us say, are you doing a good job at this or not? And no matter where you're at least now we know and we can do things to actually improve that, and we can try to move the needle. And so I think that's one of the first things that, for us as a company that measures patient experience and measures employee experience, is to really say, hey, like there are specific behaviors that will engender trust with your patients, that will engender trust with your staff. Let's make sure that we're all aware of what those are, and let's measure those, and then let's actually aspire to get better once we have metrics around them. So yeah, I think that's an important place to start, because I think for a lot of people it's like it's a truism, right? Like, being kind is important, or being trustworthy is valuable, and you're like, yeah, of course, like, but what does that mean to me?
So what does it mean? Like, tell us some of the behaviors and then how do you measure them? Because I feel like, do you have to have a ride or die in every aspect of your life? Or is there like a level of trust that's still quality that might not necessarily be like the level I might have with Rich or David or somebody like that?
Totally. Yeah. I think that they're for sure, like in any relationship, right? You're going to have different levels of this, but I think how we think about it with patients is different than how we think about it with employees too, right? You have a different relationship with your patients than you do with your employees. And so talk specifically on the employee side a little bit, because I think that's a huge problem that a lot of practices are struggling with right now is employee retention and workforce, right? Is something that I can't go anywhere and not hear, hey, workforce is a huge problem for us right now. And our retention rate is, I was at a conference not too long ago, and Rick Workman from Hartman was, or from Heartland was talking about, what their retention rate was for docs. And you're like, cool, that's a good number, but like, what does that mean in isolation, right? And it's a lagging metric. If you're only measuring employee retention, do you have the tools that you need to do anything about it? And so we are, we've licensed some IP from an organizational trust expert in this space to say, hey, like we can do this and we can scale this as a software company. And so the three kind of foundation blocks or building blocks of trust are competence. So you need to be good at what you do in a kind of normal way, problem solving, and care for others. So those are the three kind of core building blocks. And then there's various specific parts that we measure within each of those to help build what's called, an overall trust score within your organization. And we can also measure what we call the trust gap. So from the C-suite to the frontline staff, right? Like, what is that gap? Does your C-suite think you're doing amazing and your frontline staff's like, oh, definitely not? Or is there, relative consistency there? And obviously the smaller the trust gap, the more cohesive the organization is. And so, the way I think about it with some of these things, right? Like, you have to be good at what you do on an everyday level. Like if things are just running along normally, to me, that's competence, right? Like, hey, I'm just good at my job. I'm good at doing what I do, right? You have to be good when things are normal. And then in every business and every practice and every group out there, things get chaotic and things go awry and things don't go the way that you hope them to go, whether that's you're growing so fast or whether that's patients aren't showing up or something bad happened in clinical care today or whatever it might be, right? And so how do you solve those problems when they arise? That's, the second element there. You can be really good at both of those things and you can not be a nice person, right? And so you care for it. So you kind of need to have all three of these things to really create a fully trusting organization, and to have staff be like, yes, on all three aspects of this, we're totally bought in. It's great if you have two of the three, but you can still do better, right? And we can kind of help organizations figure out where they can do better.
That's great stuff. So when you're working with a new organization,
Yep.
and this is all brand new to them, do you find that do you focus on one of the three before the other two? Like how do you introduce, a little bit at a time of each bucket?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. And certainly same in our patient experience, right? We have 14 experience metrics that we look at across the patient journey. And then, we kind of bring that data back to organizations to say, hey, same thing, right? Like, how are you doing in each of these 14 metrics? It's impossible to focus on all 14, even in three buckets, right? Within your employees, it's hard to focus on maybe all of the behaviors that fall within one of those buckets. And so generally the way that we look at it is, hey, you're going to want to talk about some of the things that you're doing well. So if you're, sharing this data back with your staff, or if you're sharing your patient experience data back with your staff, you're going to want to highlight the successes, right? Make sure that we are finding the bright spots and calling those out. On the patient experience side, we find that most successful practices do that in daily huddles, right? So, hey, here's three things that happened that were great yesterday that patients saw and recognized and specifically said that we did, right? Great recognition for the staff on a kind of daily basis. You can obviously find other ways to incorporate that. But on a staff level as well, right? You want to say, hey, like as an organization, if you're recruiting to new docs or whatever, we are good at X, Y, and Z. We crush it in these, specific ways. And then I think it's hard. So my background is in something called motivational interviewing, which is a way of speaking with people to help them make behavior changes. And one of the things we know from like self-management goal setting, if that term means anything to anyone, is that it's hard to focus on more than one or two things at a time. And so to your point, Dave, it's a great point. Hey, like what are the one or two areas where you see yourself with both, the most to improve upon and the capacity to do that. I think there are times as an organization where you're like, I know this is a problem and we can't focus on it right now because there are outside constraints that are inhibiting us from doing that. So what are the spots where you have bandwidth and you notice and you've seen in the data, yes, we need to do something about this, and focus on that. And I think the thing that we see too, a lot of organizations will do a staff satisfaction survey, like, once a year, right? And it's a checkbox. Or maybe they're doing something like ENPS and it's like, cool, that's great. Like you're doing that consistently. That's awesome. You have this kind of pulse on where things are at. But you don't really have any specifics on like, if it's 50, great. Like, why is it not 70 or why is it not 30? So you need that kind of granular information to really be able to go in and make it actionable. And so measuring that consistently, right, is something that we talk about with our organizations around, hey, you need to be looking at this at least every month, right? That's the default setting in our software. Like at least every month, this is going to go out to your employees and you're going to get some data back and hopefully you're paying attention to it so that you can say, hey, for the next month or two, we're going to really focus on this, see how the data comes back. If it's not improving, great. Like we can get into why. If it is, that's awesome. Maybe there are other spots now that we need to look at.
I like that.
Who's the organization though? So for a lot of practices, the dentist is the only like constant. Like anybody else can leave whenever they want, right? So I mean, we don't want that. We all, strive to have a really great team that are all lifers, right? But the reality is the organization oftentimes lands on you as the dentist. Is this something where there's a test that every person in the office takes, and so then you take the summation of them or the average of all of them, and that kind of gives you an idea of what your organization looks like? Or is it the dentist who does this and like I just have to build my skills as a leader and as the owner of that practice?
No, for sure. We believe listening to everyone is super important. So everyone from the front desk staff all the way up to the, if you're in an organization that has non-clinical folks that are not even on site, right? And so then how do you separate that out to be able to say, cool, here's the, front desk versus the dental hygienist versus, the doctors or whatever. And so being thoughtful about that, I think, is important because there could be spots in your organization where you only look at the aggregate, right? That you're going to miss, hey, like there's actually a problem with the hygienist maybe, and how do we actually go in there and work with them to, build this trust back up with them that we've lost potentially. Maybe we're doing something that, specifically impacts them that doesn't impact anyone else. And so I think it's important to look at it at that granular level, as well as like various other ways, right? So, hey, like let's slice and dice the data for people who've been here for, less than a year, for people who've been here for greater than 10 years. Are there differences, right? Like, how do we think about those things? So those are a lot of the things that we've kind of built into it to really help organizations understand, hey, here are the spots where you can and need to focus while still maintaining, anonymity, right? Because if you're like, let's slice it 6 ways and now I know it's this person, right? You're like, that's then we're just using it to weaponize the data, and that's obviously not what we want.
You brought up something that's really fascinating to dig into is as you slice it and you look at maybe team members who've been there for a decade and people who are brand new. Maybe this is a unique experience of mine, but what I've experienced in our practice over the years were is great as we all thought we were. When a new person came in, we had so much trust with the people who've been there for 10 years that although we were welcoming, people felt this like, wow, these people really are all in on each other. And it almost created this little like natural tension. Like, what do you do to help improve that for the people who are, in that boat?
Yeah, the clickiness factor, right? I think that's certainly a reality for sure. And I think, the first thing around that, I think, is to recognize it, right? If you don't have information about that, data, I would say, to start with, but then also like just a recognition to your point of like, hey, it seems like when this happens, this person feels excluded in some ways or feels, and so I think one of the things that we see in some of this is those to be able to look at that data consistently during onboarding, especially, and to be able to check in with those folks and really kind of say, like, here's our goal for like what, but to set reasonable expectations as well, right? To say, hey, look, like we all believe X, Y, and Z. This helps us to do, to practice in this way and for patients to feel this way when they come in here. That might feel a little foreign to you right now. And our hope, right, is that we will, kind of teach you these things, and you'll be able to give us feedback too on, hey, like this isn't working for me or whatever. So to me, that it's an expectation setting thing.
Sure.
And that culture piece, right, is, there's in the motivational interviewing world, like the idea of like working with a new patient. One of the founders says, every single patient interaction is important, but the first interaction is the most important, and the first 5 minutes of the first interaction are the most important. And I think it's the same thing for our new employees, right? Like we have to be as on as we can from minute 1 through day 90 or 120 or whatever, until we really feel like they're starting to understand the culture of our practice. Because otherwise they can feel like, wow, I'm like on the outside of this weird clicky world that everyone else seems to be a part of, and I'm not.
Yeah, that's an outstanding frame, I think, when we onboard people, is to help them understand like we're so super close here, so it could feel a little off, and here's all the things we're going to do to help, you know, help you not feel that way, and to, welcome you in. Pam, like I've watched the evolution of your team in the last, I don't know, year or so, and you've captured that magic with your team. So I don't know, what do you think like made that difference for you?
For me, what made the difference was I had to change my outlook on things. When I bought my practice, I tried to just sort of like do things the way the previous doctor did, and to
Hmm.
sort of, my goal was to just not lose patients. Like, I don't care about anything else. I just don't want to lose patients, and I don't want it to be so different for anybody. But then finally COVID came, and it was like my first time I had time to like think about things in life. And I was like, you know what? Trying to fit into this mold that you're never going to fit into is stupid. And I'm just not going to be sorry for who I am and what I'm about, because I'm actually trying to level up the practice, and the people around me are killing me. And so I decided I'm not going to be sorry for what I want for my practice. And I need to surround myself with people that see things the way I see things. And so
Love that.
it took a minute, like 6 years, to come to that realization. So I always tell people, like, don't do as I do as what I'm telling you, because it's way
Mm.
better now. But yeah, no. So now it's sort of like we know right away, like if you're going to work or if you're not going to work. And it's pretty quick because, I'm so sure about what I want for people who work for me and the way I want my patients to be treated. So I have a question though. So like, I feel like if I was, say, we've got all these dentists listening, like I feel like some dentists might be like, do I really need to do this? Like, am I going to open a can that I don't really want to open, or should I just leave well enough alone? Would you share a story about, maybe somebody who, maybe didn't have the trust, but then when you opened up this dialogue, I know, David, you're so interested in having the conversation and being upfront, but a lot of people are like, you know what? I don't want to kick that bear. Let's
Yeah.
just go to work, do our job, go home and not talk about it. So like, would you tell us a little bit about maybe how somebody maybe kicked the bear and how it turned out to be better?
I can tell you some stories about people who've kicked the bear and found it to be worse for them too. So I'm certainly not afraid of that, right? There are definitely people out there who are like, yeah, I don't want this, right? Like, because I would say on the patient side, or on the employee side, listening is hard, right? Feedback is hard. We as humans, I think, have some built-in protection mechanisms when people start to say things about us that feel like growth opportunities. And it all, depends on your mindset, right? Of like, if you have that fixed mindset or that growth mindset, and generally people who have a growth mindset are going to be more receptive to feedback. But it's still hard. Even if you have a growth mindset, it is hard. And so we have had customers who are like, this is awesome, we're so excited to do this. And then they start rolling it out and they're like, oh, I'm hearing things I don't want to hear, and I am done. Right. And you're like, cool, great. Like, that is totally your prerogative. And we can't force you to want to do this. Right. So that is true, I think, for people. And I think people have to recognize like, hey, is this just going to be too hard for me? Right. Um, but I've also seen it so what some of our customers have done as well, which I think this can be helpful, right, is they might be working with someone already, like a consultant or somebody who comes into their practice to help them. They have a trusted relationship. It's like a therapist, right? Like a practice therapist. And it's like, cool, I don't want to see all of the I don't want to see how the sausage is made, but like I know I need this, right? So like you be the translator of all the hard things and you help me kind of come and understand so that I'm not like going to go jump off a cliff every time an employee says this place sucks or a patient says like you're so mean, right? Or whatever it is, right? Um and so that I think is often for those types of people who it may be harder for them. We've seen that be successful of, hey, like who is the trusted intermediary to communicate this information to you so that, because really what we're looking at is the sum of, the system, right? We're looking at everything. You're not always going to be able to solve every individual problem for every patient or for every employee, but we can in aggregate look and say, hey, we have a gap here, we need to address that. And so for those types of people, that kind of interpreter, I would say, tends to be a helpful way to think about it. In bigger organizations, that can happen. People have that job title, right? Of, hey, we're going to be the director of learning and development, or we're going to be, the chief clinical officer in some cases, right? Where it's like, hey, this is how we're going to do this, or maybe it's the head of HR if you were talking about, employees, right? So in bigger organizations that happens. In smaller organizations that might not be the case, and so there just are times when it's like, hey, this isn't the right fit. We had someone tell us once, like, around the patient experience, it was like, it feels like patients are telling me how to run my business. And like, yeah, I mean, they're going to walk out of here thinking exactly what they're thinking, but at least now, so you can change it if you need to, right? And even if you're not going to change it, wouldn't you rather know what patients are thinking than just be like, I'm going to do me, right? And in some ways you have to do you, but in other ways, if you're not willing to adapt and change to like what patients need, that can be a really slippery slope. And really, because we've all been there with like someone who's like, I've done it this way for 30 years. And you're like, yeah, but you're like super irrelevant now, right? So
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of goes to that saying, right? Your brand isn't what you say it is. Your brand is what your patients and your community says it is. So I agree with you. Like as the leader of the team, you can choose to not change and say, you know what, that information, I appreciate it. I'm going to keep rolling the way that I roll, but it's so helpful to have that information for sure. Wow.
And
how's the information collected? Like, is it through interview? Is it a survey? Because I would imagine that teams or some patients might be like, how honest can I be before, they get fired or something?
100%. Yeah. So we collected via survey and have done a lot, put in a lot of fail safes to like ensure that no one's identity is going to be divulged. Right. So, that's super important to us, both on the patient side, because the way that we collect patient feedback is like, hey, this is an anonymous and private feedback to your practice, right? Which is a very different way of asking for feedback than like, hey, can you leave me a 5-star Google review? And you're like super transactional, one way, like, no, what the patient's getting nothing out of this, dentist, you're getting plenty, right? Versus, hey, we really want to improve. We'd really appreciate your feedback. It's not going anywhere. Like, just, we would love to know, right? That feels very different. That feels more like a trusted relationship than a like, hey, I'm just going to use whatever you say. It's very transactional in that way. So we've done, specific things like on the patient side, right? Like we don't collect the data immediately. We collect it the day after. We don't show the data from the time that it was sent. We show it from the time that it was collected. There are ways that we've, kind of just to ensure, like, obviously patients can say something that's like going to identify them. And the same thing with staff, right? If it's like, hey, if you're leaving feedback that's like very specific, then you probably can be identified here, even if you don't want to be. But on the employee side, right, where we have a window of data collection, we have ways that if there's a certain if there's a number of people in a certain department and only one person's filled it out, right, like we're not going to show that back to we might show the like aggregate data, but we're not going to like show the specific data. So ways that we try to protect that as much as possible. You can't obviously be perfect if someone wants to be identified, but we try to do it in a way that is indicative of the system, and doesn't let the data be weaponized to the best of our ability.
I also like you mentioned something earlier, because Pam, you're right. Like, and I wasn't always this person who like wanted to find all these things out. That wasn't me the first 15 years of my career. But you mentioned something that, big organizations do this really well because they have like that's somebody's position. So if you're a dentist out there and you're not in a big organization, the concept of identifying somebody on your team who maybe is that go-between, who can be that voice, who can be that intermediary is really powerful. And we should probably really do that in a whole lot more areas of our practice than we already do. But I don't know, maybe that makes us nervous to like anoint a team member with, a position like that. But I think our team members crave it, number one. So to be able to elevate and grow within our practice, but to be able to leverage somebody on your team, if that's just not you who feels good about this conversation to have, it's still a really important conversation to have.
Mm. That's really well said there, David. I think that this is happening, right? That's what we tell people all the time.
Yeah.
Like these employees are feeling this way, patients are feeling a certain way, whether you know it or not. And so it's worth it to lean in, and if that can't be you, like you said, great, like let somebody else take ownership of that. Who cares? Who's like, yes, I want to know this stuff and I want to help people.
Yeah.
And if it's a dentist practice owner and that's it, right? Like maybe you're too close, right? Like you don't want to fly too close to the sun in those moments. And so maybe it is helpful to actually remove that a little bit, to have somebody else who's like, hey, this isn't my, like, I don't own this practice, but I am committed to seeing it improve and be the kind of workplace that we all want to be in. So I think that's a really wise way of thinking about it.
Very cool.
Are there lesser known attributes that enhance or detract from trust that we might not be thinking about?
It's a great question. I think let me talk about the patient side first here. On the patient side, there are behaviors that we kind of internally refer to as like table stakes behaviors, right? So like you've got to do these things well or people will leave, right? And so those can be things like ease of access. Like, can I get an appointment when I need it? It's like, hey, if I call in and try to get an appointment tomorrow and you say I can give you an appointment in 3 months, like I'm not coming back. Like if I've ever been to your practice, right? I just won't do it. Wait time is another table stakes metric. Price transparency is another table stakes metric. If you fail and falter in those ways, right, like people will leave. And that's a different level of trust, I would say. It's like that's a competence metric if we're using similar language on the employee side of like, can you do the job that you say you're going to do? But then really what we see in terms of like the kind of like leveling up or the trust building metrics are things like listening, empathy, consideration for patients in general, involving them in their decision making. Those are trust building behaviors that, great, if you're doing that other stuff well, people won't leave, but that's not going to go out there and make people be like, wow, this is so great. Like I trust my dentist so much, whatever that might be. So on the employee side, I think about that, in a similar way to, hey, there is this like competence metric of like, can you do the things that you say you're going to do? And I think we all can, think of those. There's plenty of ways where it's like, hey, when I say I'm going to follow up with you, I actually do follow up with you. Like there's just like basic things that are really important. But then I think like on the care for others side is certainly where I would say, that in the same way on the patient side, right? Like you have some more of those kind of trust building specifics that are harder for people in general. So you might think like, oh yeah, listening is important, of course. And you might think you're like a good listener because you shut your mouth and like open your ears, and that's the start, right? But like people generally know that listening is more than that. And so I think that how people interpret some of those things, especially on the trust building things, it takes a lot more than, just the cursory, like, hey, yeah, like we have a value that says listening is important, but no one here ever does it, So that's kind of how I think about it, at least from a framework perspective. I don't know if that totally answered your question, because you're like, hey, what are those things that we don't think about? But I at least wanted to like share that kind of like, here's how internally we feel like trust is built both with patients and employees.
All right, so I'm a little negative. So
You're
I'm just
not.
no, I mean, honestly, like if my trust is broken, like for me, I feel like, and maybe it's a defense mechanism. Sometimes it's just easier to cut your losses and move on. Like, can you truly restore trust once it's
Mm-hmm.
lost or damaged?
It's a great question. So again, from like an I think of this in like the individual level versus the systems level. On an individual level, that might not be possible. And Pam, I think your question's super interesting, right? So it's like, I'm negative. I think in this way of like, I'm going to be the naysayer maybe of like, hey, this is going to be, hard for me. I think we all do that, right? Of like, when someone breaks my trust, how do I feel? And I think oftentimes it's like, how are we potentially breaking other people's trust? That might be a good first question for us to ask in those situations, because I think we're probably doing things that are, we're all doing things that might not be enhancing trust, right? And so, it's kind of, we got to take the log out of our own eye before we start complaining about the stick in someone, or the speck of dust in someone else's eye. So all that to say, but I think it's super normal, right? And so your point is, can that, or your question is, can trust be restored? I think that there are times, especially clinically, where that is not like, it's just not, there are non-negotiables, with clinical care, especially, right? Like safety is one of those things, right? Like there are times when it's like, hey, did you do a timeout and you anesthetize the wrong side of the mouth? And the patient's like, what's going on here? And you're like, cool, like we're going to have a very serious conversation about this. And if it happens again, like I can't trust you. Like, this is unsafe. I have to, there are those kinds of trust situations where it's like, this is just totally unsafe. Versus like, are you a good listener or not? That's a much grayer scale, I would say. And so in that way, like if someone's not a good listener, can they become a good listener? Of course, right? Like we all have that capacity within us. And so the way that I think about this structurally is that like, I would expect all of my employees to want to improve in those ways that are more of those kind of grayscale metrics, right? Like, and I would even put that in job descriptions, and I would put that in performance reviews and whatever. Like, I don't expect you to be 100 out of 100 listener, but I certainly expect you to care about it and to be working to improve it. And if I can tell that you don't, or you're not, right, then yeah, like, of course, then we have, severed that bond of trust of like, hey, you haven't met the expectations that we've set out here. So to me, that's how I think about it, is like, is this a black and white kind of trust issue? Did you like directly lie to me? Or, are you just sometimes bad about, like taking credit for something you didn't do, for example? You try to seek that credit. Okay, that's a little different. Like when we can talk about that and we can work on that. Why is that happening versus like, you lied, like, and you continue to lie. So anyways, that's how I think about it.
This is tremendous. And so like my conversation to have for 100 hours. I can't believe like we're already this place. But Matt, like you kind of started this whole thing off with, competence and problem solving and, the kindness factor and being nice to people. How do people learn more about you, what you're doing? How do they reach out to you?
Yeah.
How do we get you back on here again?
Happy to come talk whenever you want. We'll just keep like being on each other's podcasts, and it'll be super fun. Yeah. So differentkind.com is our website. Feel free to go there. That's the first place that I would encourage people to go if they want to learn about Different Kind. Specifically for me, LinkedIn is the only place that I have social media. So feel free to connect on LinkedIn, or feel free to email me, matt@differentkind.com, if you want to have a deeper conversation and explore what, any of this stuff, have a NA beer or whatever it might be. Happy to do that with anyone at a conference. Certainly these are things that I'm super passionate about and love discussing. So thanks for the opportunity to do that with both of you today.
Yeah, it's been amazing, Pam. Holy smokes.
I know. Matt, thank you so much. This was so interesting. Certainly gave me a lot to think about, and I'm sure everybody else out there the same. So definitely we want to have you back. We must have you back. We need to talk more, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, guys, till next time, next week. Hope you all have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone, for watching or listening to the show this week. And thanks to our guests and sponsors on this episode.
Please check out our social media at Dr. Pamela_Maragliano and at Dental Economics Official.
Or you can check me out at Ignite DDS or at Dr. David Rice.
And go to dentaleconomics.com to receive dental economics. You can choose to receive DE in print or digitally, and you can also get the details of our Principles of Practice Management Conference on our website.
If you have time topics or guests or anything you'd like to talk about on the show, send us an email to dentistryunmaskpodcast@gmail.com, and we will do our very best to make it happen. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.